Hello, everyone, and welcome to our final session of this weekend's programming for the National Day of Remembrance. We began yesterday with a conversation about racial reckoning and Japanese American museums. Each of the past 5 sessions has engaged with the past to help us think critically about our present and the futures we want to build. I am so grateful for every single person on screen and watching from home who has participated in these conversations. As we heard yesterday, Day of Remembrances are an opportunity to gather as a community to remember and, in doing so, to re-engage with the communities and the world around us. This weekend, we mark the 80th anniversary of the signing of Executive Order 9066, which brought about the dispossession, removal, and incarceration of more than 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, who were our great-grandmothers and great-grandfathers, our grandmothers and grandfathers, our mothers, fathers, siblings, friends, loved ones, ancestors. As we honor, remember, and love each of their memories, let us take a moment to reflect on the conversations about healing, renewal, justice, and community that we've had together this weekend. This final session, which we've called Passing on the Torch and Empowering Communities, is a truly fitting way to bring our gathering to a close. Over the course of the next hour, we will hear from 6 speakers about their community and solidarity building work. First, we'll hear from Bryce Ikamura and Chris Fitzgerald together, then Connie Masuoka, Vinicius Taguchi, Erica Moritsugu, and Jeffrey Robinson. I'm so looking forward to hearing about the work each of them is doing and to thinking together about how empowering communities is an important path to reckoning with histories of racism and injustice. Before I introduce our first speakers, I want to take a moment to pause, as we've done for each of our previous sessions, and invite each of us to acknowledge the Native peoples whose ancestral homelands we currently occupy, and to encourage all of us to learn more about the pasts and presents of the vibrant Native communities who make their homes here today. As we mark the significance of this anniversary for Nikkei communities across North America, let us not, in doing so, cover over the backdrop of enslavement, genocide, and removal that animates American history. As we look forward from this weekend's programming, may we each take with us the energy and the courage to continue reckoning with our past and working towards a shared future built on justice and on joy. And now, without further ado, let me introduce our first 2 speakers. Chris Fitzgerald joins Kizuna as the new executive director back in December 2021. Coming from a background in the arts and youth development, he is excited to uplift youth voices and remove barriers to access and opportunity in our communities. And Bryce Ikamura is a half-Chinese Shin Nisei born and raised in Los Angeles. He's been involved with Kizuna since 2014 as a counselor, instructor, program participant, and now serves as the organization's board chair. From 9 to 5, he works as a partnership manager in multicultural advertising to drive meaningful community impact. Chris and Bryce, thank you so very much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation to be here. It's an honor to sit down with everyone on the panel and to represent Kizuna. Like you said, I'm the brand new executive director here. And so I'm going to pass it to Bryce, who's actually an alum of our programs. And now, as you mentioned, is our board chair. So Bryce.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And thanks, Aaron, especially for moderating all weekend. I know that you've been in a ton of conversations, making sure that everybody, is facilitating correctly and is working on time. I also wanted to thank National Park Service and Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, as well as the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, for holding the space for us and allowing us all to tell our stories. I'm extremely honored to be here speaking among such an incredible cohort of community leaders who are each going to be telling their own stories. But before we jump into Day of Remembrance, I wanted to just give folks a very brief overview of Kizuna as an organization. We are based out of Los Angeles' Little Tokyo, and our mission is to build a future for a community by educating, empowering, and engaging the next generation. In particular, our programs introduce students to culture, heritage, and community, starting as early as kindergarten, with a pipeline that takes students on a journey through elementary school, middle school, high school, college, professional careers, as they all develop their own sense of identity, social responsibility, and community engagement. Now, as we think about an 80-year legacy that has allowed our community to experience elements of generational privilege while building infrastructure And I want to thank Dr. Odo and Ann Burrows in yesterday's panel for emphasizing the importance of physical place. One of the questions that we've been asking is, how do we continue to preserve this story and our experience while moving forward? And I think that events like this are incredibly important, especially as different iterations of it happen all over the country this weekend. Kizuna also has programs specifically that do highlight the incarceration, but Kizuna was also born with the future in mind. And so as we talk about some of our work, Kizuna really attempts to nurture community leaders with identity, respect, and understanding at the core of their leadership styles and leadership preferences. Specifically at the tail end of our pipeline, it produces community leaders who serve at the highest level of organizations, providing both perspective and direction, in addition to, of course, time, talent, and treasures that are expected of all board members. But we also realize that a leader doesn't necessarily have to be somebody who is, holding the flag, who is running forward at the front position, but rather that it's somebody that, aside from accolades and titles, is just somebody who has a passion for the mission and a willingness to put in work to drive organizations forward. And so a few years ago, as a part of our high school leadership program, my good friend Craig Ishii, who was directing the program at the time, really wanted to think about how do we flip leadership on its head. And the term that he came up with was organizership, a concept that where traditionally, top-down perceptions of leadership are flipped and secondary really to our students learning how to work together with a community in mind. We found that it was much more important to recognize that because not everybody necessarily wants to be that kind of leader at the front of an organization, that it's much more important to teach people how to work together, especially as we consider all the different organizations that now exist in our community. Just incredibly important to make sure that folks understand how collaborations can be formed. And so while we do understand and believe that youth are the future, something that we've kind of recognized in the last 10 years is that the perception and sense of community that folks have seems to be changing and shifting. And I think that's highlighted a lot by so many of the various social events that have happened over the last few years. Black Lives Matter, xenophobia, anti-Asian hate sentiments. The perspective that people have about what community means is much more global. And I think that's important. So many community organizations, for instance, have wrestled with how do we meaningfully engage the Shinike community? And one of the first steps here, I think, is to decentralize our own trauma and begin to recognize the experience of others. I think that as we consider how to continue healing as a community, we need to consider what other people have been through. And I do want to highlight Takanishi Hiroko's short story, The Right. It's a semi-autobiographical story about the aftermath of the Hiroshima bombing, as told from the perspective of a Japanese schoolgirl on her journey to process her trauma. In the story, she experiences pain and suffering of those around her as they use different rituals or rites to find peace. I highly recommend that folks take a look at this story as we consider the importance of perspective, but if I can just share a quick excerpt, something that really stood out to me. The anger, the deep hate come after the event. The thing that parted me from Junko, that kept Kyoko from me, although she wanted to see me again, that made me cower all night in a hollow in the ground. If I could catch the real nature of that thing and fling the fullness of my anger and hate at it, I would not be in torment to this day. Well over 10 years after, tied to this fierce anger that still finds no proper outlet. I think that really encapsulates the importance of understanding and hearing other people's stories. And the reason why I haven't talked about my own family's experiences with the atom bombs or with incarceration is because as a Shin Nisei, my dad came to the US after the war. For the longest time personally, I didn't understand or resonate with incarceration experiences either. And even in reference to the story I shared earlier from Takenishi Hiroko, my grandmother lived in Tokyo, my grandfather lived in Osaka, and so they didn't experience the violence or the horror of World War II as viscerally, but they were absolutely impacted by the war. And they lost everything. So they came to the US for a better life. It's not unlike so many other Americans who come here as well, seeking that better life. And I feel the need to clarify that this isn't meant to compare trauma in the twisted oppression Olympics, but it's the opposite, really. I think we need to recognize the privilege and experience that our community has built and begin thinking about in what ways our community can leverage our resources to support others. A rising tide lifts all boats. And so in a kind of conclusion, Aaron mentioned that, earlier my title professionally is a partnership manager. And so partnerships are always at the forefront in my mind. But I really want folks to think about, how do we work together? Where are there opportunities to integrate programming, especially for nonprofit organizations? How can we use partnerships to expand capacity and capability to drive issues forward? At Kizuna, we are looking at the future as a collaborative vision. And I really think what we need to consider is, how do we all collaborate to reach the future together? I'm looking forward to the Q&A and being able to discuss more of this with the group. But thank you so much for letting us share.
Thank you so much, Bryce and Chris. And Bryce, you raised such important points and things that we've talked about, I think, in different ways during the sessions this weekend. So thank you so much. And I am looking forward to returning to some of those themes in the Q&A. Next, I'm delighted to introduce Connie Masuoka. Connie is a Sansei with roots in Oregon and Hawaii. She fancies herself a community promoter and currently serves as board president of the Japanese American Museum of Oregon, JAMO. She's a long-term Portland JACL board member who is, in COVID times, developing the Kimochi Project, a program of senior empowerment. Connie, thank you so very much for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Erin. I'm just pleased to be here. I'm proud and happy to let you know about one of our newest projects for Portland JCL that was born out of the COVID pandemic and the rise of Asian hate. We're basically a small town, small community, well, medium-sized community, smallish, and spread over a large geographic area, and currently without an anchor site like a Japantown that we're currently working on building up again. But because of that, the COVID lockdown really impacted our ability to keep our community engaged and together, especially our older members. And so we came up with this project where that we call the Kimochi Project, and we were talking about the health and the well-being of and engagement of our older and members and those who are not easily capable of accessing our community in COVID times because of an inability to hear well or use the computer. So through a generous grant from the JCL Legacy Fund, we were able to develop the Kimochi Project, and we are currently working on it. We're still in process, but it's looking really terrific. And we've done our first beta test of it, and we're so enthused about it that we think we're going to continue it long term. But what this project is to educate and train our community members, especially our older or those who appear to be less capable, about physical and personal safety, and give the participants personal alarms and pepper spray, and train them how to use them as these tools to help them provide them with a sense of security and well-being. Let's see, I lost my place here. But well, we had this great project. We got them all together. We beta tested this and had someone come out and teach them about these safety techniques and have them meet in person, which was really good for the older folks. We provided an open space in a place that they were familiar with, the place where we usually go to for our annual community picnics. Um, did all the COVID spacing and everything, and we were really surprised at how well they took to it. It not only brought them a feeling, we thought that would make them feel safer and give them a better sense of well-being, but what it really did was imbue them with a sense of confidence, um, and gave them an ability to want to model um, actions and persona that would that would dispel those stereotypes that we link with the biases that fuel racism and Asian hate. And as a bonus of that, the kids that saw, we had students helping us do this, and the kids who saw us do this were just amazed and about how tough and resilient and strong and just great that these their grandparents and older folks were about doing this, and gave them kind of a inspiration of doing it for themselves, so, and passing that on. So that's pretty much what we've been doing, and we're working that up to take that on to um, the greater community, and maybe pass it and create a template to pass it on to other communities of color in Portland.
Thank you so much, Connie. That's so great to hear about, and I'm excited to see where the project grows to. I am so happy to introduce our next speaker, Vinicius Taguchi. Vinny is a Japanese Brazilian American and serves as the current president of the JACL Twin Cities chapter and the first vice governor of the JACL Midwest District Council. Vinny is also a PhD candidate in civil engineering at the University of Minnesota, where he studies green infrastructure and stormwater management. I'm lucky enough to be in a Nikkei writing group with Vinny of other grad students, so it's really wonderful to have you here, Vinny, to share some of your work with us. Thank you.
Good to be here. Thank you. All right. Yeah, it's really great to be here. When I was first invited to speak at this event, I thought, do they really want me? Like, what have I done? How can I compete with all of these amazing people? What can I fill 5 minutes with? So I thought, well, they say write what you know, so I can talk about what I've done the past few years in the Twin Cities chapter. And then once you start writing down a list of everything that's happened in the past 5 years, it gets pretty long. So suddenly I was wondering, wow, how can I fit everything into 5 minutes? But I remembered that picture's worth 1,000 words. So I decided I'm going to put a lot of pictures here, and I'll talk about as many of them as I can, and you can ask me questions about the ones that I miss. So can we go to the next slide, please? So really quick, my name is Vinny Taguchi. When people see my name, they usually don't know what to make of it in America. Vinicius isn't a super common name, but in Brazil it is. But when they hear Vinny Taguchi, usually people don't recognize Taguchi as a Japanese name. They assume I'm Italian or something. So anyway, it's a mix. And if you look at that picture in the bottom right, you see that I was in fact a samurai as a little kid. So that's the proof. But yeah, these other pictures are kind of a glimpse into what I'm doing when I'm not doing my JACL work. I'm finishing up my PhD at the University of Minnesota in civil engineering, trying to make cities more sustainable to create a healthier future. And then I find that fits really nicely with the JACL work, where I'm trying to protect the environment, but I also want to make sure that the people in those sustainable communities are also thriving. So it goes hand in hand. Next slide, please. Now, as for the Twin Cities JCL, it's a pretty old chapter. It was founded right after World War II, so not as old as some of the ones on the West Coast, maybe. But it was founded by a lot of veterans who were in Minnesota, a lot of times because of the Military Intelligence Service Language School. So the secret school that was training Nisei soldiers right out of the camps to be Japanese language interpreters for the war effort. That was right there at Fort Snelling in Minnesota. And a big part of our chapter's activities are preserving that history, making sure it's taught in Minnesota schools, making sure that we're aware of that connection that our community has here. And more, we use that as leverage to speak on other issues that are affecting people today, translating the incarceration history that our community faced with the Islamophobia, xenophobia that other communities are facing today. And I have to say, a lot of these great experiences that you're seeing in these pictures are really only possible because of the empowering community that I'm a part of, and the really supportive executive board of the chapter that put me where I am today, by literally asking me to be president, which, being voluntold, is pretty common in the JCL community. But I think it echoes what Bryce was mentioning about having your organizership, where you're not really leading for the sake of leading. You're leading because you've got this passion, you've got this idea, and people are giving you the ability and go ahead to push forward with it. So I'm really grateful for that. Next slide, please. And so when I moved to Minnesota for graduate school, I never expected to find myself at the epicenter of a global civil rights movement. But the fight for social justice is something strange, similar to the Day of Remembrance, the incarceration history. It's a big part of who we are and what we do. It's very important, but it's also something we wish we didn't have to do, right? In an ideal world, our families would not have been put in camps. We wouldn't have to be having a Day of Remembrance, right? We could be worrying about how do we have a better future. Fight for social justice is similar. This isn't something we should have to do, but it's happening, and we have to rise to meet that reality. So a big part of what we've been doing is trying to react to build our capacity, to figure out how can we meet this need, how can we be there for the communities that are closest to the violence. And a big part of what we've had to do is to begin issuing public statements. We can't just look inwardly at our community, create our events, do the education. Now we have to hold public officials accountable. We have to make sure that justice is served. We have to attend rallies. We have to add our voice to the mix. And similar to what Bryce mentioned, this solidarity and this reflection of our own history and another community's experience, I find that it really adds relevance to the Japanese American history today. It's already an extremely important part of the American experience, but when we can liken it to what other communities are facing, it just makes it that much more powerful, and it's a platform we have that other groups don't. One of the best illustrations I've seen of that is the work that Sudo for Solidarity does. So one thing that we've done recently is we started a Sudo for Solidarity chapter in Minnesota to kind of add that additional voice, that additional capacity, that additional way for young people who are passionate about social justice to get involved. The other thing we've been able to do is join with a lot of other Asian American organizations in the Twin Cities and work together in coalition. Where they say many workers makes little work. And building our capacity in whatever way we can. Next slide, please. And the other thing that my chapter has been doing, especially our education committee, that I'm really inspired by, is they decided to look forward and say, a lot of the people we have that are telling the story of incarceration and their experiences they're kind of getting along in years. And, even if they can keep doing this for another 10, 20 years, eventually we're going to need new people who can tell these stories. So they started a workshop series called Next Generations. And you've probably seen a similar one that National JCL is promoting. I've been told it was inspired by what my chapter did. But they taught us from the ground up how you go about this process and led us through it. So we began learning, how do we research our family, how do we look up our genealogy, find our history. And in the middle there at the top, you can see some documents that I was able to find from my history. They showed us how we tell these stories. And I see that I'm running out of time, but the last thing I want to mention is there at the bottom are some pictures from the Speaking Nikkei podcast that the JCL Young Professionals Caucus puts on. And that's another way that we're building a community for all of the young people, young leaders in the JCL to support one another and to do good work. So check that out if you have a chance. And you can go to the last slide. If anyone wants to reach me and ask questions about everything I didn't get to, that's where you can find me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vinny. Perfectly on time and lots to come back to, I think, in the Q&A. So thank you so much for sharing that work with us. I am so absolutely delighted to introduce another person who you may recognize from Friday evening's opening program, Erica L. Moritsugu. Erica was appointed in April of 2021 to serve as—
Thank you, Erin, so much. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm zooming in from Washington, D.C., which is located on the ancestral homelands of the Nacotchtank. I'm a middle-aged woman of East Asian descent wearing a black floral scarf in front of a blue black backdrop with an architectural rendering of the north side of the White House. I wanted to first begin by thanking Hanako, Erin, Julie, Noriko, Kimiko, of course, who's backstage, and all of those at the National Park Service, Smithsonian Museum of American History, and the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation for your tireless work in organizing this extraordinary event. It's my absolute honor to be featured here along such an incredible lineup of panelists, including a former samurai, Vinny. Thank you for joining us, sir. As the first ever Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander senior liaison at the White House, I'm charged with making sure that the richness and diversity of our Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities are not invisibilized, and that the impacts of the administration's policies are inclusive of and communicated to our communities. At the White House, as one of the president's deputies, under the president and vice president's leadership, being an advocate for communities means a number of things. To begin with, it means finding opportunities to increase representation and ensure that all perspectives are given a seat and a voice at the table. It's why the administration, all the way up to the cabinet level, is the most diverse in history and is inclusive of individuals from a diverse array of backgrounds, races, genders, generations, sexual orientations, and ability statuses. In my role as senior liaison in the West Wing, I'm constantly considering the incredible diversity within the broader Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities to ensure that I'm addressing the priorities and unique concerns, not only of the Japanese American community from which I come, but also, for example, those of our Sikh and Muslim American sisters and brothers, as well as the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander and Southeast Asians who I grew up with. Advocating for community also means speaking out against and combating injustices. That's why on his very first day in office, President Biden signed an executive order advancing equity and racial justice and support for underserved communities throughout the federal government. It's why in his first week in office, in response to the spike in anti-Asian violence, the president issued a presidential memorandum to condemn and combat racism, xenophobia, and intolerance against Asian Americans and Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. Being an advocate also means finding opportunities to empower and provide communities with tools that will enable them to thrive. That's why the president's reinstated and expanded the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders, which I'm incredibly privileged to work with alongside to advise the president on policies to advance equity, justice, and opportunity for Asian Americans and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders, specifically by addressing, among other things, anti-Asian bias and discrimination, expanding language across the federal governments in terms of access, and strengthening physical and economic security and opportunity for AN and HPIs. When I think about what it means to be on this panel, to center the concepts of community, both from a professional and a personal viewpoint, this means both censoring the individuals and families that are directly impacted in a crisis in a moment, but also remembering to be an ally in coalition and generous with a platform to accept help and to also stand with our hands behind the backs of other traditionally marginalized communities when they're in trauma. So from a personal and professional perspective, honoring and centering community means, first of all, recognizing my own privilege. Growing up in Hawaii, I had models in community to emulate. The strong tradition of leadership in the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities meant that it wasn't a barrier to see myself making an impact in small or large ways. Erin and I have spoken a lot in the past year that we've worked together about what Okage Sama Day means to us. It's a rote response conversationally in Japan, I think, for sure, which speaks to our values and what brings us to this work. But it's also a mode of being and doing for us, too. To borrow the words of a former governor of Hawaii, he translated it as, because of your shadow, which falls on me, because of your help, because of you, I am what I am. And it's closely tied while we try to make an impact in this moment to the concepts of Giri and Otagai, the obligation to those who came before and the people coming in the future. And that's not just the honoring of my parents who taught me the value of public service and being helpful and useful even without fanfare and recognition, or the influence of my grandparents' generation, the Nisei, who fought gallantly in the European and Pacific theaters during World War II, even while we had family who were incarcerated on the mainland. Or the leaders in Hawaii, our beloved Senator Inoue, my former boss, Senator Akaka, or my inspiration to serve, Patsy Mink. It's also a recognition of what and who brought me to this work professionally. My entry into the civil rights movement was through voting rights work, with the leadership and mentorship of Black and Jewish leaders, not Asian Americans. And yet we see at every Bloody Sunday commemoration, Blacks and Jews and Asian Americans and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders marching arm in arm, shoulder to shoulder, step by step with each other, many of whom wear the flower leis that honor the floral garlands that Reverend Akaka brought with him to Alabama for his brothers and sisters in the civil rights movement in the 60s as a symbol of the interfaith movement in all solidarity, in the best of the spirit of love and aloha. I also think about the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act signing ceremony that President Biden and Vice President Harris held in the White House last May. This was a bipartisan bill that was spurred by the deadly spike in anti-Asian hate and violence and sponsored by our fierce leaders, Representative Grace Meng from New York and Senator Mazie Hirono from Hawaii and Senator Tammy Duckworth from Illinois. It also included the provisions of the Jabara Hire No Hate Act, which will protect and promote safety for all marginalized communities suffering hate crimes. And it was at this first public event that included not just the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, congressional and community leaders in all of their diversity, East Asians, Southeast Asians, South Asians, Pacific Islanders, and Native Hawaiians. It also included our Christian, Muslim, Black, and Jewish leaders. 2 days ago, President Biden issued a presidential proclamation commemorating this Day of Remembrance. In it, he said, quote, "I've always believed that the great nations do not ignore their most painful moments. They confront them with honesty, and in doing so, learn from them and grow stronger as a result. The incarceration of Japanese Americans 80 years ago is a reminder to us today of the tragic consequences we invite when we allow racism, fear, and xenophobia to fester." Then the president zoomed out a little bit to have a clarion call for all of us in community. He said, quote, "I call upon the people of the United States to commemorate this injustice against civil liberties and civil rights during World War II, to honor the sacrifice of those who defended the democratic ideals of this nation, to commit together to eradicate systemic racism, to heal generational trauma in all of our communities." We're going to hear from Jeff today, who is one of the inspirations for what brings me to this work. And all of the speakers on this incredible panel, all of the panels that Aaron assembled yesterday, including the indomitable Karen Korematsu and so many others who recognize the importance of banding together, of our shared values, standing together, and at the same time naming and honoring the beauty of our differences and how we are stronger together. I was in Cincinnati yesterday touring the Holocaust and Humanities Center with the executive director, other Chinese American leaders, and Peppermint Patty of the Funkadelic fame, standing before the entryway with the graphic novel depictions of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Jim Tojo, who was incarcerated in World War II, and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Herschel. We were learning about the lessons of our history of silence and divisiveness and complacency, being a bystander, versus the need for solidarity across racial, religious, ethnic, regional, generational, political bounds, being an upstander to combat hate and remember Reverend Dr. King's pronouncement that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, and also the wise words of Audre Lorde, "I am not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own." This is the truth we live and must embrace to move forward together. Mahalo for the opportunity to share this space with you. Aaron, I will turn it back to you with thanks.
Thank you so much, Erica. Thank you for those words and so much to think about. We're so grateful. Finally, I am so honored to introduce Jeffrey Robinson, our final speaker. Jeffrey is the executive director of the Who We Are Project, which aims to become one of the central voices in correcting the American narrative on our shared history of anti-Black racism. Until April of 2021, Jeff was an ACLU deputy legal director and the director of the ACLU Trone Center for Justice and Equality, which houses the organization's work on criminal justice, racial justice, and reform issues. Jeff was also one of the original members of the John Adams Project, where he worked on behalf of one of the 5 men held at Guantanamo Bay charged with carrying out the attack on 9/11. I should say I really summarized your bio. There's so much more that we could thank you for it and note for, but thank you so much for being here, Jeff. We're so grateful to have you sharing your work with us.
Well, I am honored to be here and incredibly privileged to be a part of this panel. So thank you very, very much for inviting me. Um, I have been listening to the other speakers talk about community and the different ways that we're trying to build that and the importance of it. And I'm thinking about the Day of Remembrance, and one of the things that resonates most ominously with me are the words of George Orwell: who controls the past controls the future. And if you erase the past, you erase the footprints that led us to where we're standing today in America. And that erasure will ensure that in our efforts going forward, we will take missteps, many of them the exact same missteps that we've made before. And so I think we're living in a time where there is so much discussion about attempts to homogenize the past, attempts to eliminate things that make us uncomfortable, like the concept that Japanese Americans were imprisoned for over 3.5 years and that it was legal. It was legal to do it. And that teaches us a very important lesson about the difference between morality and legality. They are not the same thing necessarily. And without a clear understanding of the past that brought us to where we are today in 2022 in America, we will not go forward successfully. I left the ACLU at the end of March of last year, and I left for 2 reasons. Number one, I knew that there were incredible advocates who were ready to take over my position and do a heck of a lot more than I had done with it. And number two, I felt like I wanted to focus exclusively in the time I have remaining on changing the narrative about America's history and our reliance on the false philosophy of white supremacy. So starting the Who We Are project is an attempt to engage in just that kind of dialogue. And there are 3 places where we intend to engage in that dialogue. One is with our youth, and I'll come back to that in a second. The second is with community groups. And the third is with corporations and government offices, because the failure to understand our history is rampant in all 3 of those areas. 1 week before I left the ACLU last year, I was involved with putting on a program, Japanese Americans and African Americans Advancing the Movement for Reparations and HR 40. And JACL and Suru for Solidarity were part of this presentation. And my mind was opened in ways that I did not understand it could be, simply from learning from the people in these 2 organizations about the struggles that the Japanese American community went through, dealing with how do we reckon with what was done to our community in World War II, and hearing people talk about the struggles inside the Japanese American community about the bill for reparations. Some people thinking it shouldn't happen at all. Some people being insulted by the very concept of it. Other people thinking that it was absolutely necessary. And as I listened to people talk about these experiences, one of the things I learned is that, oh my God, all the things that I'm worried about in the African American movement for reparations, these folks have already gone through it. They've had the exact same experiences and the exact same struggles, and the opportunity to learn from these folks in our struggle going forward is just amazing. And there were congressional hearings on HR 40 where members of the Japanese American community testified and sent messages to Congress and had a huge impact. So as I think about these things and I think about community and how we develop community, I said I was going to come back to the area of youth. We're calling it youth because we don't want to call it schools. In states where there are not what you've heard of as anti-CRT laws, we are going to be engaging with state governments, state school boards, teachers, parents, students about getting information into curricula so that the minds of the rising generation can be impacted by the truth about our history. And in these states where there are anti-CRT laws, we're not going to be looking at the Who We Are Project to bang our heads against a wall to have litigation or lawsuits. They may be able to stop us from going into schools. But in case you didn't know, and in case you've never seen teenagers, classrooms aren't the only place where our youth learn. They may be able to stop the Who We Are Project from going into a school, but they can't stop us from going into the biggest city in a state that has an anti-CRT law, and they can't stop us from renting out the biggest auditorium, and they can't stop us from holding a day of learning and reckoning where we bring original source documents and we bring the documentary film that I've been involved with making. It's called Who We Are: A Chronicle of Racism in America, playing in over 300 screens across America during this month of Black History Month. They can't stop us from reaching students outside the classroom, from reaching teachers outside the classroom, and parents and community groups. So we are looking to build a movement in America, to be part of building a movement in America, where people reckon with the truth about our history. Not to make anyone feel guilty, because how can you be guilty about something that happened before you were born? This isn't a matter of making anyone feel guilty about slavery or the vestiges of slavery. It's a matter of making people aware of the truth about our history, and then taking that truth to go forward together in a way that is meant to heal trauma and is meant to improve the conditions under which people in America live. So I am thrilled just to have a place at this forum, and thank you very much for allowing me to be a part of this panel. The Who We Are Project, www.thewhoweareproject.org, is going to be coming with lots more once this documentary film has gone through its initial release. So we look forward to collaborating with other groups around the country to make sure that who controls the past ends up being the truth. If we tell the truth about our past, we will go forward in ways that are positive and collaborative. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much for that, Jeff. I'm going to invite our fellow panelists back on screen. And just what you were saying is so energizing and also fits so well with a lot of what we've been talking about this weekend and thinking about storytelling and reaching across lines of community. And Phil Nash, who was on a panel this morning, talked about, rather than CRT, having CCT, which I think he called cultural competency toolkits, a way to know your own experiences and use that as sort of a starting point to have conversations. And not, anyway, it was fantastic. So this is a conversation that I'd love to have with all of you in a room. Anyways, we do have some questions coming in from the audience. So please do, submit anything else you'd like to ask of our panelists. But I think to get us going, one thing that I'm asking from a somewhat selfish place is, as each of you has described the work that you've done, I can only imagine that there have been a lot of challenges. You're thinking about working with youth, taking on questions of racial justice and access. And so I'm wondering about some of the challenges that you've come across and faced in your work, and what you maybe have learned from those experiences to share with those of us who are, engaging with this kind of reckoning and justice-oriented work. So I will sort of open that up, but maybe I'll invite Vinny, you to share some thoughts, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot.
Sure. Yeah, you can be brief. This is something it's a challenge I've had to face myself. I think, like a lot of us, we were first in the Japanese American community before we were in, the fight for social justice, for racial equality. It's kind of like a necessary part of it when you're being in a community. And big part of what we've had to wrestle with as a chapter is trying to figure out what is our place in all of this. We're a small community organization. We can only do so much. Is us sending another letter to the Minneapolis chief of police going to make a difference? Is us looking at our own community and trying to move that forward, is that going to make a difference? So that was one of the first things we did after George Floyd was murdered by our police. We had a workshop for Japanese Americans and others, and we examined the unconscious bias that we all had growing up in America. What is the anti-Blackness that we have, even if we're not aware of it? What is the context in which we're approaching all of this? And if we're not at the place where we can truly help as allies, as collaborators, then we're not going to make the difference that we could.
Thank you so much, Vinny. Those conversations are difficult to have, but so important to be able to fully be part of this work. Absolutely. Bryce and Chris, maybe I'll pass this question to you next.
Thanks, Erin. Well, I mean, Kizuna has been around for about 10 years now. And our programs have stayed relatively similar across all the years. But every year, I think, we ask ourselves, how do we improve on the kind of messages that we send to the youth that we work with? And I think the biggest part of that is being able to understand and analyze our own privilege. I think, Erica, you touched really well on that earlier as well. And so as we as an organization, as a community in the Little Tokyo area, think about what that privilege means for us, I think, there are so many communities that are adjacent to where we are. I mean, Boyle Heights, Skid Row, Chinatown, Koreatown, all within, basically like 10-mile radius here. And I think when we consider what allyship means as an organization, obviously we want to be able to, I think, help folks whenever possible, but also, considering issues of mission drift, considering issues of how do we truly be allies without appropriating. I think these are all questions that we have wrestled with and that we really hope to address in the near future. But yeah, I think, speaking very frankly, they're all very, very tough challenges to overcome.
Thank you so much for your thoughts on that. Connie.
Yeah, thank you. All of those things, that is our community also. And our community is fairly small, and we are, we've spent maybe the last, up until COVID, maybe going and reaching into our community and showing the diversity in our community, because we're a very, what we term now as married out. And I don't think we realized that, that we needed to make those allyships, or that we had ostracized people of our own community because we didn't see them as truly our community. And so we've been working to have events and through the last maybe 15, 20 years of getting people to know each other, to step outside of their small cliques and organizations, to become really part of the community. And now when we go forward, when we address the government, the local governments, or we also, as JCL, we go out there and we ask and we talk to our other community leaders to have them sign on jointly with us in anything that we do. We work we try to work as a coalition and understand everybody's position to move forward and have them understand where we are coming from. And we take their vote very seriously as we move on. We won't move on without them. And if there is a reason why, we will talk to them about that. So now we've gone into COVID, and that's been even more important, where we're also addressing things like our anti-Blackness issues. We went through that. We've done a number of things and number of courses. In fact, next week we'll be screening the film Reparations, and having a conversation uh, with our members and people of the film and TKK, and it's going to be an interesting leap for us to do that. But I'm really proud because we've got this young group that's moving forward, um, and taking us a lot further than we've been in the last 10 years.
Thanks, Connie. Yeah, I think this theme of storytelling and intergenerational storytelling and work is so important here. So, Erica, I'd like to ask you the same question about some of the challenges and how you've overcome them in your work.
Sure. No, I appreciate the question. I'm going to try to figure out which tack to take because there are so many challenges, but so many opportunities that I'm so excited to embrace with y'all. One of the things, I'll just start with this, is operating in these wrought times where I think we're in a time of reckoning and turnarounds and inflection points, all of us in communities of color and marginalized communities, working in the construct in Washington, D.C. with a dominant culture. And so I'll state that as a challenge, but then I'm going to brag on my president. Luckily, he gives us the space to do this, and he intuits this, and it's a part of his values. And aided by, of course, his close partner, Vice President Harris, is both deferential to what he knows and also what he doesn't know, and gives space for that conversation. Which is a generosity and I hate to say a little bit unusual based on my many decades in this town. And so a privilege and an honor to be a part of that dialogue because it really is a dialogue. I think that also lends itself to the frustration in community because if just taking the spike in murderous violence against East Asians and East Asian presenting women in particular, why have it's not the work of a day, because it's not just over the course of the pandemic that this hate and xenophobia and violence has persisted. It's been for hundreds of years, and that's a little known tale. And the narrative picks up with the viral videos of our elders and our children, the treasures of our communities being attacked, vicious mass murders of Asian women in Atlanta and Sikh Americans in Indianapolis. That catches the imagination of mainstream media and mainstream politicians and policymakers for sure. But from the federal government perspective, our levers are not universal. Like, you can't legislate hate out of people's hearts, which is why this panel that you've assembled is so important, because that is actually the turning point for me when I can't legislate hate out of people's hearts. It has to happen in community, and that's why the leadership of my colleagues here is so important. 2 weeks ago, the president and the vice president spoke at the National Prayer Breakfast in the Congress, bipartisan, and he told the story that really informs and ignites us, but also shows about the different levers with civil society and everyday community members wanting to do good and building that muscle memory of what it is to love and not hate. With the hostage crisis at the synagogue in Colliesville, Texas, while we were still waiting and monitoring and activating, the local imam of the Muslim community locally, his wife knew what the rabbi's favorite food was, brought it over to the Catholic church that was next to the synagogue where the hostages were being held to give comfort and solace to the family members who are waiting and worrying. And it's those kinds of stories, because that's real community work. That's deep in community that, we can have a hand in at the federal level. We can encourage it. We can use our bully pulpit. We can use better words to love, not hate. But really, it's got to be the knitting together of all levers. But deep in community, the work that my colleagues here on the Zoom screen embody and bring to us, that's the most important thing.
Thank you so much, Erica, for those words. And Jeffrey, I'll turn this question over to you now.
I think what I'd like to say on this issue, there's two things. One, the title of the documentary film that I've been involved with making is Who We Are, a Chronicle of Racism in America, not the Chronicle of Racism in America. It's a 2-hour documentary film, and if it had been the Chronicle of Racism in America, it would have been a 10-hour documentary film. I was trying to tell the narrative of what happened in my community. I did not feel, for example, that I had the agency to tell what happened in the Japanese American community because I didn't live that experience. That's not to say that I can't support others in telling that, but that was not my story to tell. However, I collaborated on this film with Emily Kunstler and Sarah Kunstler, 2 white women, daughters of the iconic civil rights lawyer William Kunstler, who raised them to be anti-racist activists. And so as we have talked about, like, what's our place, what's our role in this, in a larger community, Sarah and Emily are filmmakers. I had never made a film before. I knew nothing about making films. They came to me and they said, you'll own the entire film. You will have final editorial control over what goes into the film and what stays out of the film. And they gave that to me. And as I went forward, people kept coming to me saying, are you sure? Do you have this in writing? This isn't the way it works, Jeff. You know, how can you have ownership of this film? Well, I had it because Sarah and Emily Kunstler walked the talk of being an anti-racist ally. And because I had complete ownership of the film, when we sold the distribution rights to Sony Pictures Classics, 100% of the purchase price, including 100% of the future earnings, goes to the Who We Are Project to fund that work. That couldn't have happened without Sarah and Emily coming to me in the way they did. By telling me I had complete editorial control, what they were saying was, we're not trying to tell you what to say about your experience. We're not trying to tell you what to say about what happened in your community. We're trying to help you do that. And of course, by the end, we're trusting each other and working together. So Emily Kunstler edited this film. It is I'm biased, but it is an incredible film. And I could not have done what Emily Kunstler did to make this, to take a PowerPoint presentation and make it into an incredible film. But by being anti-racist allies, the 3 of us came up with something that is bigger than any of us could have come up with individually. They could not have contributed what I contributed to the making of this film, and I couldn't have contributed what they contributed. The history that we are talking about has been stolen from all of us. This is not Black history. This is American history. This is not Japanese American history about the imprisonment. This is American history. And it is up to all of us to not only reckon with it, but resolve it going forward together. And if we do that, then I think we will literally see radically different decisions being made going forward because they'll take into account the truth about our history. And if we do that, the sky is the limit.
Yes, thank you so much for those words, Jeff. I mean, you pick up so beautifully so many of the threads that we've been talking about as far as thinking about healing and reckoning this weekend. So thank you so much for those words. Erica, we did have a question yesterday about the proclamation that you gestured towards in your talk. And I was wondering if you could say just a little bit, I know it's a quite involved process, but about how that proclamation came about.
Yeah, I think I'm not going to bore you with the bureaucratic machinations of the process of the interagency clearance and getting to print and all of those things. But it is a source of great pride. And I say it pridefully, but also pride in the president, pride in the community, because those are mutually knitted together. No president has ever issued just a simple proclamation commemorating the Day of Remembrance. The National Park Service did yeoman's work, drafting and researching it and heavily footnoting it because it's a first ever proclamation. The process is a little bit more involved. to make the case for a departure of precedents. And, you know, we wanted to embed in there, because of the values of the president and the vice president, and what that they wanted to honor this year in the 80th anniversary is not just the commemoration of another sad anniversary, but also an acknowledgement of where we've come from and where we want to go, and how we do that and with whom. And so you see a lot of language imbued in there about allyship. You see a lot of language about the use of language, whether or not, you know, concentration camps versus internment, you know, needs to go to the wayside because they are not accurately depicted, when it is the preference of the surviving families and the community to use incarceration. And it was also the product of listening to the community. The community had asked for it, and the community had access to ask for it. And I have a boss who will take that in train and put it into action. And it also happened to be, and I know we're at time, I just want to call out one other thing, because on its way to the White House right now is a bill establishing Amachi as a historically preservation site. It was passed by unanimous consent, so bipartisan, non-controversial, Republicans ceding to it to get it sent to the president's desk in time for the Day of Remembrance. These are the moments that we live in, and these are the moments of, I mean, it's a win and a celebration of a sad occasion, but it shows you where our hearts and minds can lend us when we take the time to build coalition, to build the understanding, when we honor our past in order to learn from it and do differently and better. So that's my story.
Thank you so much, Erica. And I think this panel is such a good reminder also of the responsibility that we have as a community to look beyond our community as well, to take advantage of, I know several of you mentioned the privilege that we have these sites to return to, that we have this kind of Day of Remembrance that is rooted in activism and the movement for redress and the art that came out of it, that now, you know, we have a responsibility then to look outward. So we are at time. And so I want to ask each of you a final question to leave us with some final thoughts or reflections, basically about how can others get involved and what are our steps moving forwards? What's the charge that you would like to leave us all with? And I will not call on folks. I know that's a big question. So please jump in as you have thoughts, and just thank you so much again.
I want to say this very quickly. Everyone saw what happened on January 6th and the desperation of those people. We now see people screaming in school board meetings, don't teach my children this critical race theory thing that can't be taught until law school, even though my child is in the 4th grade. The desperation that we are seeing is an indication that those who do not want us to go forward together as a community see something happens that scares them. And so if you're wondering, is there any opportunity for us to make real progress going forward? Those who don't want us to make that progress see it coming, and they're terrified. This is what it would look like if America was on the verge of going somewhere very different. And for those who want to maintain the status quo, did we really think they were just going to sip tea and eat crumpets and say, oh, our day has gone past? No, this is what it would look like. So if you are wondering if this is the time to engage in community, to push our country forward, the signs are there. And so I'm not an eternal optimist, but I can see what's in front of my face. And the signs are there that we can do things in this country, especially with the generation that we have coming up. Thank you all again for letting me be part of this. It has made my day.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for being here. I know that's a tough one to follow up on, but other closing thoughts or reflections?
Well, so for Kizuna, if you want to get involved, I invite you to check out our website and take a look at some of our programs. We do serve the Southern California area right now. But I think especially for this panel, and thank you all for sharing such incredible insight. I think the future for at the very least, the Japanese American community, but really the country, we're moving in a multi-ethnic, multi-denominational, very integrated, and yet somehow still very separated, people. And I think, Jeffrey, to what you were saying earlier about the Japanese American reparation experience, and as Black folks also seek those same reparations, there are parallels between so many of our communities, not just Japanese American and Black, but really across all racial lines. And I think I wish I could close with a quote of my own, but Vinny, I want to just, something that you said really stuck with me, was just that solidarity adds relevance to the Japanese American experience, and I think that as we move forward, that's something that I would love for our community, for our organization, for this group here as well. I mean, just to really consider and think about, and again, calling back to what I had mentioned earlier, but how can we use partnerships and collaborations to expand capacity and capability and to build community together? And so I think that's kind of where our mind is at here, but thank you again so much for allowing us to be on this panel.
I guess I can go next. So the most important thing that I've learned in working with the grassroots community organizers in Minneapolis is something that they've been saying for a long time. I'm learning it recently, but this is not new knowledge, and that's that the process equals the product. So we don't know what the solutions are to these complex issues. Even if you say, oh, I want to help the Black community, well, there isn't one Black community, and there's no consensus about what the solution is, what is the best thing for everyone. And you'll find that with any issue, if you look closely enough, there's a lot of nuance. But the best thing you can do if you don't know where you're going is to make sure that how you get there is the best that it can be. People are talking about what true allyship is. How can you be there? How can you be respectful of people, of their experience, of their story, of their agency? If that is a part of everything you do, you're going to get to a good place. And so when it comes to how can you get involved, you can really get involved in just about any way. So if what is your passion? Not all of us have to be standing with a megaphone and giving an inspirational speech. If you're an artist, you can create some graphical art to promote an important event, lend your voice to help someone else. If you're a writer, there's plenty of things to write about. There's no shortage of that. But no matter what it is you're good at, there's a place. Even when I'm looking at my work as a civil engineer, what does that have to do with racial equality? Well, as I'm building these green infrastructure projects to build more sustainable cities, I've noticed that there's a really unsettling correlation between where these projects are going in and where the property value is going up. So I'm directly, unwillingly a part of gentrification. And I can't necessarily stop that, but I can bring attention to it. I can give a voice to the communities that are going to be displaced by this project. I can bring them to the decision-making table and try to make sure that they have as much agency as possible in what happens to their community. So no matter where you are, just take a look around you and ask yourself what you can do. I'm sure there's something really important you can.
Can I follow up on that?
Absolutely.
Just because it's so important what he's just said, because that would be my final word here is to show up. We're exhausted. But you don't have to show up in the same way, but you should show up, and in whether it's marching in allyship with other communities or speaking out and giving voice to your own story. This is our source of power, and we do it in a collective. And it's informed and animated by our own individual stories and our own individual contributions. I was going to drop in the chat, but I was afraid I was going to leave the studio by accident. But there is a sign up for the White House Initiative listserv. And so that's one way to keep apprised of both the events that the White House and the administration are making available. We do a lot of roundtables and listening sessions, but also a point of entry for you to tell us top of mind for you, and what you see us doing well or not doing at all, or what we could do better. That's also another way of showing up too, so that we can do differently and better. So Erin, thank you very much for this chance. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, all of you. I mean, I personally just feel very lucky to have been able to hear all of you speak. Connie, I know you need to step away, but thank you so very much for being here. I'm sorry we went a little bit long. And thank you everyone watching along at home. This has been a wonderful weekend. All of these programs will be available on YouTube for the future, so please return to them. As we wrap up these 2 days of programming, I just really want to thank again our planning partners, the Japanese American National Museum, especially David Inoue and his leadership at the JACL National, Friends of Minidoka, White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, and our many, many, many community partners who are listed on the American Museum National. I'm not even going to try to say it. I'm sorry. It's been a long day, but the Smithsonian's website about these events lists all of our community partners. Thank you so much for your work and support. A huge thank you to Kimiko Mar behind the scenes, who's been running everything so smoothly. Without you, this just would not happen. And to our co-sponsors for this event, the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, the Smithsonian Institution, and the National Park Service, especially Hanako Wakatsuki, Dakota Russell, Julie Abo, and Noriko Sanafuji. And thank you so much, Jeffrey, Bryce, Chris, Vinny, Erica, and Connie, for closing us out. What a wonderful conversation. I am so, so grateful. Wishing you all a wonderful rest of your Sunday evening and a good week ahead. Thank you so much again.